A body by the bridge. A witness who vanishes in fog. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Alexander. Tell me, where in the world are you unraveling this mystery from? I always look forward to your comments. Don't hold back. Now, let's begin. The windows of the Quai des Orfèvres were steamed with the faint warmth of radiators that had been on too long and not strong enough. Outside, a dull mist hung over the Seine like a thought that would not lift. Across from Maigret's window, the Pont-des-Arts was nearly invisible in the haze, its faint outline stretching from one bank to the other like a charcoal drawing softened by a child's thumb. Maigret stood at the window with a pipe between his lips that he hadn't lit. It wasn't that he'd forgotten. It was more that he didn't feel like interfering with the stillness of the office. He could hear the usual murmur of typewriters behind the frosted glass wall to his left, and the deliberate shuffle of papers in the outer office. But for the moment, everything else seemed to move slowly, like the mist outside. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular. The morning had begun without incident. Madame Maigret had made coffee that was too hot, served with tartines of butter and plum jam, which he had eaten without speaking. She had offered to mend the lining of his overcoat. It had torn again near the inside pocket, and he had grunted in agreement. But she had already taken it from the peg before he finished his sentence. There was something in the air today. Not a foreboding, but a sort of bitterness that clung to his coat sleeves, like the trace of old tobacco. It reminded him of his early days in the force, when cases came, not with ceremony, but as whispered rumors passed between beat cops and railway workers. He turned slightly as the door clicked. It was Sergeant Lucas, holding a sheaf of typewritten notes and a face full of practiced neutrality. "There's a matter in the 6th arrondissement. A small gallery off Rue Bonaparte. They phoned it in, but, well, it's not quite a case yet." "Huh?" Maigret took the notes without looking at them. He didn't ask what the matter was. Lucas had already said it. Not quite a case. Which meant something odd, unexplainable. Possibly nothing. "Did Lugnon go?" Lucas allowed himself the faintest smirk. They offered it to him. He said it was beneath his dignity. Thought it sounded more like a lost pet than police work. Maigret nodded once, absently. Of course. Lugnon, always certain something big was just around the corner, never content with what actually came through the door. The mist over the Pont-des-Arts was thickening now, slowly swallowing the far end like a curtain drawn from the opposite side of the river. Maigret finally lit his pipe, drawing the flame to the bowl without taking his eyes from the fog. "What do we know?" Lucas recited flatly. "An art student, 21, Claudian Yearn, found in the gallery this morning by the owner. She was supposed to help open for a small exhibition. Gallery had been closed for 2 days, no forced entry, no signs of violence." "No signs," Maigret repeated quietly. "Nothing missing. But she was. ... Sitting on a chair in the back room. Just sitting. Dead." He drew in from his pipe again. It was a strange description, but he'd heard stranger. "Was she known?" Lucas shrugged. "A few sketches in the Salon des Indépendants last year, nothing major. The gallery owner says she was punctual, studious, quiet." Maigret moved from the window and reached for his overcoat. Forgetting Madame Maigret had taken it, he stood there for a moment, staring at the empty peg. Lucas made a half motion toward the rack with the others, but Maigret raised a hand. "Never mind. It's not far." Outside, the mist had a way of softening the cobblestones and lamplight, making Paris feel older, gentler, but also somehow more uncertain. As he crossed the street, Maigret passed a woman pushing a pram slowly, glancing at him with the detached curiosity people had for policemen not in uniform. He didn't hail a car. He preferred to walk when the weather pressed against the skin like this. It sharpened the senses. Not in any dramatic way, but enough that he noticed things. How the cafe tables were stacked slightly askew near Rue Dauphine, or how the fruit seller's awning dripped precisely in time with the ticking of his pocket watch. By the time he reached Rue Bonaparte, the mist had turned to a soft drizzle. The gallery was wedged between a dusty bookshop and a tailor's storefront, with a faded blue door that looked as if it had once been repainted in a hurry. The brass plate beside it read simply, Galerie André. Inside, it smelled of old wood, linen canvas, and something more peculiar. Linseed oil mixed with a trace of citrus. A tall, nervous man with horn-rimmed spectacles stood at the threshold to the inner room. His hands were trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the remnants of it, like a bell that had stopped ringing but not yet stilled. "You're Maigret?" he asked, though he already knew. The chief inspector nodded and didn't offer his hand. Instead, he took in the walls. A few monochrome sketches, some mild cubist oils, nothing to startle, nothing to remember. "I'm André Tissot. I own the gallery. She was Dottie one of my part-time students. She helped me arrange things, took deliveries, cleaned frames sometimes." Maigret didn't answer right away. He moved slowly to the door of the back room. It was poorly lit, the bulb overhead giving off a dull yellow pallor. Claudine Linger sat in a plain wooden chair, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if caught listening to something long gone. He stood there for a long time, 5 minutes, perhaps longer, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just a stillness that had already begun to settle into the wood of the floorboards. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "She looks like she waited for something." André said nothing. Maigret turned to face him again, and this time the pipe was back in his mouth. "Tell me," he said softly, "what kind of girl waits alone in a closed gallery and doesn't leave?" André blinked, once, slowly, but he gave no answer. Maigret didn't need one. Not yet. The mist outside pressed closer to the glass. The chair on which Claudine Linger sat was the kind found in every atelier and modest gallery in Paris, practical, worn at the corners, with a faint polish left behind by years of damp cloths and nervous hands. It wasn't the kind of seat one chose for comfort, and yet there she was, arms resting limply by her sides, head tilted just so, as though she'd paused in a moment of contemplation and forgotten to breathe again. Maigret stood in the doorway of the rear room, the smell of varnish and old linoleum mixing with the trace of cold damp carried on his coat. Behind him, the owner, André Tissot. There was a faint squeak in his shoes every time he shifted, and Maigret found it oddly telling. The man didn't know where to stand, and he seemed afraid to sit. "Who found her exactly?" Maigret asked without turning. "I did," came the reply, a fraction too quickly. "I arrived this morning to prepare for the new collection. We had an appointment with the framer at 10. "You found her like this?" "Yes. She hadn't been answering her phone, but that wasn't so unusual." Maigret stepped forward, careful not to scuff the polished boards. There was no sign of disarray. No overturned furniture. The table against the wall had a few pencils scattered across it, a chipped porcelain cup, and a small blue notebook. He reached out, lifting the notebook between 2 fingers. The cover was worn. Inside it was mostly blank, a few pages of light sketches, doodles of rooftops and shoes. On the 3rd page, a line of writing in tight, upright script. La pluie fait sortir ce que les gens gardent. Rain brings out what people keep hidden. Maigret frowned faintly. It wasn't a note. It didn't claim to be. And yet it felt like something left behind. He turned back to Tissot. She had keys? Yes, of course. Anyone else? No, just her. I always open myself when she's away. There's only one set of internal keys. Maigret gestured toward the gallery's front room. They walked together, the wooden floor creaking softly in the silence that had settled over the place since the discovery. The paintings on the walls stared blankly out, the kind of abstract work that neither accused nor explained. In the dim morning light, they looked more like shadows than compositions. He asked gently, "How long had you known her?" 2 years, maybe a little more. She came recommended by a colleague. Said she was quiet but reliable. She wasn't particularly talkative. Did she have friends? I wouldn't know. She didn't talk about her life much. She left when her work was done. Maigret took this in without nodding. There was something evasive in Tissot's delivery, though not overtly so. A kind of practiced distance that art dealers sometimes adopted when discussing artists who hadn't sold. Whether it was habit or guilt, Maigret could not yet say. He moved again toward the rear room, lingering near a canvas leaning against the wall. It was a landscape. Foggy fields, perhaps Normandy, rendered in quiet, mournful tones. Not Claudine's work, he imagined. Too studied, too restrained. You say she was working toward an exhibit. No, not quite. She was still a student. She helped here part-time. Framing, correspondence, making tea for buyers, that sort of thing. Did she paint? Of course. Everyone does, but not here. She never showed her work here. Maigret looked again toward the girl in the chair. Her coat was slung over a stool in the corner, pale green wool, slightly frayed at the sleeves, practical, not fashionable. He moved to it and slowly patted the pockets. Inside, a few coins, a bus ticket, a folded note from a dry cleaner. No keys. No keys on her, Maigret murmured. Tissot blinked. What? That's strange. She should have had them. Maybe she left them somewhere. Maybe someone else took them. Maigret didn't look at him when he said it. He was watching the way the mist thickened outside the rear windows, the ghostly blur of figures passing on the street beyond. We'll need to speak to anyone who saw her last. Was she here yesterday? No. I thought she might come, but I didn't see her. Do you live nearby? Above, in fact. There's a small flat above the gallery. Maigret raised his eyes. You didn't hear anything during the night? I was out. I stayed at a friend's. Late dinner. It was raining, you know. Maigret did not reply. He didn't write it down, either. Instead, he walked slowly through the gallery again, taking in the faint smell of damp plaster, the worn skirting boards, the stack of wrapped canvases near the door. A young officer, pale-faced and sharp-shouldered, appeared in the doorway. He had a notepad and a faint sheen of rain on his cap. They've taken the body, Chief, for examination. Nothing obvious, Maigret nodded, then turned to Tissot. We'll talk again. For now, don't change anything here, and if you find those keys— He didn't finish the sentence. He simply stepped out into the morning. The rain had thinned to a misting drizzle. On the corner of Rue Bonaparte, a baker was sweeping wet leaves from the front of his shop, his expression set somewhere between fatigue and indifference. Maigret lit his pipe again and waited until the first draw brought warmth to his mouth. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She had sat in that chair and waited, or accepted. Not a struggle, not a break-in. There had been trust. At the Quai des Orfèvres, He asked Lucas to check the dry cleaner's tag. It was tucked in her coat. It might tell us where she lived. Lucas nodded. And another thing. There's a girl, Claudine Linger. Check her at the École des Beaux-Arts. Friends, classes, anything. Lucas looked up. Do you think it's connected to her work? Maigret shrugged. She didn't leave much else. Back in his office, the mist was still visible from the window, the Pont-des-Arts now nothing more than a pale streak in the distance. Maigret sat down, filled his pipe again, and opened the blue notebook once more. Rain brings out what people keep hidden. He tapped the page gently with the side of his finger, as though testing whether the words had weight. There were no sketches of people, no self-portraits, only rooftops, corners of rooms, the same bent stair railing drawn from slightly different angles. Not the work of someone showing off. The work of someone watching. And that, perhaps, was where the trouble had begun. By the time Maigret returned to the École des Beaux-Arts, the mist had thinned into a steady drizzle that tapped gently against his hat brim. The school loomed behind its stone gates, with students huddled under awnings and others moving briskly between courtyards, their portfolios held like shields against the weather. The building, with its cracked plaster and smell of damp canvas, was strangely comforting. A place built not for perfection, but for repetition, for trial and error, for silences that gave way to form. He waited by the reception desk, quietly watching the girl who attended it, her hair tied into a tight bun, eyes darting occasionally to the door, as though she expected someone she didn't want to see. When she finally acknowledged him, it was with a blink, not a smile. Yes? Maigret didn't show his credentials immediately. He leaned slightly forward and said, I'm here about Claudine Linger. I understand she was a student here. The girl hesitated. She was. Studio 3. Downstairs. She hasn't been in lately? No. I hadn't noticed. She frowned, as if now realizing the weight behind the question. Has something happened? Maigret didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he said, I'd like to speak with someone who worked closely with her. Another student, maybe. The girl nodded and scribbled a name on a small slip of paper. Jacques Médelac. He's in the sculpture class. Room 7. He knew her better than anyone, I think. Room 7 was at the far end of a corridor that smelled of plaster dust and turpentine. Maigret passed a row of open doors, each revealing variations on the same scene. Smudged windows, students leaning over easels, models seated motionless on stools draped in old sheets. It was a world that seemed somehow untouched by the idea of death. Jacques Médelac was tall, with hollow cheeks and sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands were covered in clay up to the wrists, and a cigarette burned low in the corner of his mouth. He didn't look up at first when Maigret entered. He was carving something too delicate to rush. Only when Maigret spoke did he pause. Excuse me, Jacques Médelac? The young man looked up, cigarette now between his fingers, and frowned slightly. Yes? I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. I'd like to speak with you. About Claudine Linger. There was no dramatic reaction, no dropped tool or stunned silence. Just a slight stillness in the shoulders, and a brief, controlled inhale. Is she in trouble? Maigret shook his head slowly. She's dead. Jacques said nothing. He placed the cigarette down in an ashtray already filled with crumpled butts. Then he walked to the sink, ran his hands under the tap until the clay peeled off in slow spirals, and dried them with a cloth that had once been white. Only then did he turn fully toward Maigret. How? She was found this morning, in a gallery where she worked. No signs of violence, no struggle. Jacques nodded slowly. That sounds like Claudine. Maigret tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? She didn't fight things, she let them happen. Or she let them pass. Was she troubled? Jacques shrugged, but it was a careful shrug. One Maigret had seen often, the kind that concealed more than uncertainty. She was quiet, thoughtful, a bit solitary. Did she have enemies? Conflicts with anyone here? No. She was polite to everyone. Maybe too polite. Too polite. Jacques looked toward the half-finished sculpture on the table beside them. You know the type. Never complains, never interrupts, but you can feel something simmering underneath. Maigret didn't press. He waited. Let the silence do the asking. Finally, Jacques added, I think she was afraid of being noticed, and more afraid of not being seen at all. Did she talk about the gallery? She mentioned it, yes. Said she liked it, mostly. Said the owner was distant, but respectful. And did she mention anyone else connected to it? A buyer, perhaps? Jacques thought for a moment. There was someone she spoke about once. A man, older. She never gave a name. Said he came into the gallery often, never bought anything, just looked at her sketches and asked strange questions. What kind of questions? She never told me. Only said he asked about what she noticed in people, their eyes, gestures, that sort of thing. Was she frightened? No, not exactly. But she stopped mentioning him after that. Maigret took out the small blue notebook, opened to the line again, and held it up. Do you recognize this? Jacques looked, his brow furrowed slightly. That's her handwriting. She liked to write things down, fragments, phrases she heard in cafes, little quotes from books. Does this sound like her? He read the line again, slower this time. Rain brings out what people keep hidden. Yes, that sounds like her. Outside, the drizzle had thickened again, tapping at the window panes with more insistence now. Maigret closed the notebook and slipped it back into his coat. Where did she live? In a bedsit off Rue Jacob, 3rd floor, no lift. I went there once. She'd forgotten her scarf in the studio. Did she seem lonely? Jacques didn't answer right away. He lit another cigarette. She had no family in Paris. She'd write letters to her sister, I think, in Nancy. But she never sent them. Maigret filed that away. Letters not sent. Keys not found. He thanked Jacques and left without ceremony. There was no point in lingering. The young man had told him everything he could, and perhaps more than he meant to. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas met him at the entrance. She lived in a room over a bakery, Rue Jacob. I've sent someone to check. The dry cleaner's tag matches an address nearby. And? The concierge said she didn't get many visitors. Just the gallery owner once or twice, and a man, well-dressed, hat and scarf, mid-40s. That's not much to go on. No, Chief. But the concierge remembers the smell. Maigret raised an eyebrow. He wore cologne. Something bitter. Said it clung to the stairwell for hours. Maigret exhaled slowly through his nose. Something people try to forget, he murmured, but can't. He moved to his office, closed the door, and stood again at the window. The Pont-des-Arts had re-emerged through the thinning mist. Just visible now, a ghost bridge, linking two shores that didn't quite speak to each other. He thought of the girl again, sitting on that chair, as if listening, as if someone had once whispered something to her and she had kept still ever since, waiting for the echo to return. The rain had begun again in earnest by the time Maigret stepped out onto Rue Jacob. It was not the kind of theatrical downpour that filled gutters and turned hats inside out, but the steady, insistent drizzle that made one feel, after 10 minutes, as though they'd never been dry. He didn't open his umbrella. The weight of the water somehow helped him think. The building where Claudine Yearn had lived was a narrow 4-story affair with a boulangerie at street level. The sort that smelled warmly of butter and faintly of yeast, its window fogged from the ovens inside. Above it, the iron grates of the balconies were rusted in places, and a pale vine had curled up from the second floor, clinging to a drain pipe like it, too, was trying to escape the weather. A concierge, hunched and wearing a cardigan several sizes too large, met him at the foot of the narrow staircase. Her hair was pulled into a loose net, and her fingers were stained with tobacco. She was a quiet girl, the woman said, not waiting to be asked. Polite, paid on time, never made trouble. Maigret nodded and gestured up the stairs. Room still locked? She reached into her apron pocket and retrieved a brass key. Only I have the spare. She never lost hers. She may have lost something else. The concierge squinted. She didn't have many things to lose. Maigret ascended slowly. The staircase creaked with the age of its wood, the steps worn into shallow bowls by decades of tenants. On the 3rd floor, the corridor narrowed, lit only by a single bulb near the far end. The air smelled faintly of damp plaster and something older. Not rot exactly, but the lingering breath of time. The room opened with a reluctant click. It was small, as expected. A narrow bed beneath a slanted window. A folding table with 2 mismatched chairs. A bookcase filled not with books but sketch pads stacked on their sides. The scent hit Maigret at once, not overpowering, but precise. A trace of bergamot. Faintly bitter, faintly citrus. It wasn't from the bakery below. He stepped inside. Lucas, who had arrived just minutes before, was kneeling near the small writing desk. Clean place, Lucas remarked. Too clean. Maigret nodded. There were no cups left unwashed, no discarded clothing. A small stack of pressed blouses hung neatly behind a curtain that served as a makeshift closet. On the desk sat a half-used box of pencils, a pocket mirror, and a jar of dried lavender. She was expecting to come back, Maigret said quietly. Lucas turned. You think someone lured her to the gallery? Not lured, invited. Or simply asked. He moved to the window. It faced the rear courtyard, a grim collection of chimney pots and laundry lines. Rain traced long streaks down the pane, and he saw no signs of intrusion. No footprints on the ledge, no forced shutters. Anything missing? He asked. Lucas pointed to a small drawer. Inside a bundle of letters, tied with thin twine. Maigret untied them carefully and leafed through the pages. All were addressed to Elise, the sister Jacques had mentioned. None were stamped. All had been written in a meticulous, almost cramped hand. Maigret read a few lines at random. I saw the man again today, Elise. He asked me about the painting of the woman with the folded hands. He didn't ask about the frame, or the light, or the technique. Just her hands. And another. I think he's lonely. He never looks directly at the art. He watches people watching. He noticed. I should be flattered, but it unnerves me. The last letter, undated, ended mid-sentence. He came yesterday again. This time he asked if I ever draw what I'm afraid to see. I didn't answer, but it stayed with me all night. Maigret folded the letters again, more carefully than before. There was something delicate in the way she had written, not secretive but restrained, as though confession had to tiptoe past the edge of something deeper. Lucas stood and moved toward the wardrobe. No sign of the keys, he said, but the concierge said she heard footsteps on the stairs around 11 the night before. Not unusual? Lucas shook his head. She says usually the hallway is silent after 10. Maigret nodded and turned slowly in place, absorbing the room not as a scene of a crime, but as the shape of a person. Claudine Leguerne had left few marks on the space. No photographs, no notes pinned to the walls, no laughter lingering in the corners, but the scent of bergamot told him she hadn't been alone. Someone had been here. "Check the neighborhood perfumeries," Maigret said. "Ask if anyone bought bergamot oil or cologne recently. Something distinct, something that lingers." Lucas made a note. Maigret picked up a sketch pad from the shelf. Flipping through, he found the usual exercises: hands, rooftops, cafe interiors. But the final pages showed something else. A series of increasingly sharp portraits, all of the same man. Not identical, but similar in shape. A middle-aged face, neat beard, hat pulled low, eyes never fully drawn. In some, he was looking at her, in others, looking away. He turned the pad and let the light from the window catch on the page. The eyes, the ones not drawn, were somehow the most disturbing, as if even she had feared to imagine them fully. Maigret lowered the sketchpad slowly. "She saw something," he murmured. "Not an act, not a crime. A person." Lucas glanced back at the door. "Someone known to her? Someone she didn't want to know better?" They left the room as they'd found it, closing the door gently behind them. Back on the street, the rain had lightened, but the sky still hung low and grey. Across the road, a man stood smoking beneath the awning of a bookshop. He watched them a little too long, but when Maigret glanced his way, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. He didn't drink it, he simply held it, letting the warmth reach his fingers. The sketchpad sat on his desk beside the notebook. 2 different records of silence, one drawn, one written. Lucas entered half an hour later, shaking the rain from his hat. "We may have something," he said. Maigret raised an eyebrow. "There's a perfumery off Rue de l'Université. The shop girl remembers a man, 40-ish, neat, charming, asked a lot of questions about base notes, left with a bottle of bergamot cologne, paid in cash, gave no name. Description: brown overcoat, hat, thin beard. She thought he looked like a lecturer or a writer, said he was soft-spoken, seemed to want to linger." Maigret leaned back. They were circling something now, not a murder weapon, not an alibi, but a presence. A man who watched paintings, not for beauty, but for the people who looked at them. A man who smelled of bergamot and left silence behind. The following morning, Paris wore its rain like a memory. The gutters still murmured with the flow from the night before, and the pavements glistened with a film of light that reflected blurred silhouettes of passers-by. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres early, before the clatter of typewriters had begun. His coat was damp at the shoulders, but he didn't remove it. He stood at the window, pipe unlit, gazing once again at the mist-wrapped silhouette of the Pont-des-Arts. The bridge seemed always to be there when he thought about the girl. Not as a place, but as a kind of question. People passed over it daily without looking down, without seeing what flowed beneath. It was like that with Claudine Leguerne. Lucas entered with a folder in hand. He placed it gently on the desk and sat opposite, smoothing his damp cuffs. "The perfumery girl came to the station this morning," Lucas said. "I asked her to work with an identikit artist. She's certain of the man's build and facial hair. The rest, she says, was indistinct, like he didn't want to be seen clearly." Maigret flipped open the folder. The sketch was precise, but not vivid. A man of about 45, narrow jaw, beard closely kept, hat angled to cast a shadow across the eyes. It was the kind of face that could vanish in a cafe without drawing a second glance. "No one we know?" Maigret asked. "No hits in the files, but I ran the description past a couple of patrolmen near Rue Bonaparte. One of them remembered a man like this hanging around the gallery. Sometimes came just before closing, never bought anything, never gave his name." Maigret placed the sketch beside the blue notebook and the sketch pad from Claudine's room. 3 impressions of the same man. None complete. "She didn't draw his eyes," Maigret murmured. "She drew everything else, even his coat, but never his eyes." Lucas nodded slowly. It unsettled her. Or he was someone she couldn't face fully. The room settled into quiet. Outside, the bells from Saint-Germain chimed once, muffled by the rain cloud still clinging to the rooftops. Maigret stood and reached for his hat. "Let's go back to the Galerie," he said. "I want to look again, not for what's there, but what's changed." They arrived just after 10. The Galerie André was as subdued as before. The same brass plate, the same dull blue paint on the door, but something in the air felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. André Tissot greeted them with a weak smile. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, his hair less meticulously combed. "I didn't expect you again so soon," he said, stepping aside. Maigret nodded toward the gallery interior. "No one else has been here?" "No. I kept it closed, as you asked. The paintings still hung in their places. Angular figures in muted colors. A few abstract cityscapes. A still life of a cracked bowl." Maigret walked slowly, as if in a museum he knew well but had not visited in years. The floorboards groaned faintly under his weight. He paused before a painting in the far corner. A simple rendering of a woman sitting on a bench, her umbrella closed beside her. Her face was indistinct, more shadow than feature, but her hands were finely detailed, almost too carefully. Fingers curled slightly inward, wrists drawn with aching delicacy. Maigret turned to Tissot. "Is this new?" Tissot blinked. "No, that's been here for months. Isn't it work? Not Claudine's." "She mentioned this painting to someone," Maigret said. "He asked her about the hands." Tissot hesitated. "I didn't know she discussed it. She noticed more than people thought." They moved toward the back room, where Claudine had been found. It had been tidied. The chair was no longer in the center, but pushed against the wall. The table was bare now, the notebook removed, the pencils put away. Maigret stood silently. He looked not at the floor or the furniture, but at the walls. "Something's missing," he said softly. Tissot furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "There was a canvas here," Maigret said, pointing to a section of wall slightly paler than the rest, larger than the others, roughly a meter wide. Tissot paled. "That was one of Claudine's. An unfinished piece. I took it down before you arrived the first time." "Why?" "She never intended to show it. It was crude. Personal. Just something she worked on during quiet hours." "Where is it now?" Tissot looked uncomfortable. "Upstairs, in my apartment." "I'd like to see it." They followed Tissot up the narrow staircase behind the gallery. His flat was modest, 2 rooms, clean, with shelves filled with catalogues and art books. In the corner, propped against a radiator, was the canvas. Maigret walked to it without being invited. The painting was unfinished, but potent. A single figure, seated in what might have been the gallery itself. The chair was recognizable, so was the table. but the figure was distorted. Head turned too sharply, shoulders hunched. The face was blank. Not unpainted, deliberately blank, like someone erased from memory. "Is it him?" Lucas asked behind him. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He bent slightly and traced his finger along the edge of the canvas. A fingerprint in the paint, smudged, as though someone had touched it recently. "She painted him here," Maigret murmured. "In the gallery. The same chair, the same setting before she died." Tissot was quiet. When Maigret looked up, he saw that the man was staring at the canvas with something close to discomfort. "She never showed this to me," Tissot said. "But I remember her working on it. Near closing time." "Was he ever here when she was painting?" "I can't say. She often stayed late. I trusted her with the key. They left the painting as it was." Back at the station, Maigret dictated a brief request. Circulate the sketch of the unknown man to select bookshops, art cafes, and private collectors along the left bank. The kind of places where one could loiter and ask questions under the guise of appreciation. That evening, as dusk folded over the city like a soft coat, Maigret sat again by his window. The bridge was lit now, lamps shimmering through the thinning mist. A couple passed by slowly, sharing a single umbrella. In their quiet rhythm, he saw something of Claudine, the way she might have moved, the way she watched without being seen. She hadn't run, she hadn't fought. She had painted. And the man who watched her, he had seen more than he should have. The next day began without urgency. The weather remained undecided. Not fully rain, but not dry either. Just a persistent dampness that clung to the walls and hung in the corners of stairwells. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret arrived late, not out of laziness, but because he had lingered over breakfast with Madame Maigret longer than usual. She had spoken little, only pausing now and then to mention how the butcher had overcharged her for veal cutlets. It was the sort of conversation Maigret found curiously anchoring, a small reminder that the world continued, even as certain names stopped being spoken. On his desk, someone had left a list of addresses. Lucas had been thorough. The cafes and bookshops along the left bank, where artists and art dealers mingled. Places where someone could disappear by appearing interested. Maigret sipped his coffee and glanced out the window. The Pont-des-Arts was there, as always, and as always it seemed just out of reach. He lit his pipe, then picked up his coat and the list of names. He decided to start with Le Temps Perdu, a small café bookshop on Rue de Seine, known for its quiet afternoons and the faint scent of ink and roasted chicory. The place had no sign outside, just a wooden plaque with the silhouette of a watch without hands. Inside, the shelves were high and the tables narrow. A man could sit for hours and not be noticed if that was his aim. The owner, a woman in her 60s with square glasses and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper, greeted him without surprise. "I'm not here about anything urgent," Maigret said. "I'm looking for someone who may have passed through." He placed the sketch on the table, held down at the corners by a sugar bowl and a salt shaker. She adjusted her glasses and looked. Then she nodded, slowly. "Yes, he's been here," she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who remembers atmospheres more than names. "Several times. Always late afternoon. Never ordered much. Tea, sometimes just hot water." Always sat in the back. "Did he speak to anyone?" "Only me. He asked about a book once, something on Vermeer." "Vermeer?" She nodded. "I told him we didn't have art history." He didn't seem disappointed. Just thanked me and sat back down. "Did he ever bring anything with him?" "No, not even a book. Just sat and watched." Maigret glanced around the room. The corner she indicated had a narrow view of the street through a crooked window. From that seat, one could see who entered and who left. but few would notice the man sitting there unless they were looking for him. He left her with thanks and a card. Should he return, he said, just call. You needn't speak to him. Her eyes were sharp behind the lenses. He seemed harmless, but I've been wrong before. The next stop was a gallery called Maison Granger, just off Rue Jacob, a higher-end affair with cleaner lighting and glass frames. The owner, a stout man with a silk cravat and watchful eyes, frowned at the sketch. He came by twice, looked at the exhibit, asked nothing, then left. What did he look at? The portraits. We had a series on the human expression. Intimate pieces. He lingered on one. A woman with a child on her lap, though you couldn't see the child's face, just a hand. Did he speak to the artist? No. He didn't want to be seen, I think. That's what stayed with me. He looked like a man practicing the art of being invisible. Maigret stood silent for a moment. Back on the street, he turned the collar of his coat against a cold wind that had crept in from the river. The Seine was sluggish beneath the gray sky, and the air carried the smell of wet stone and coal smoke. He returned to the station just past noon. Lucas was waiting. The gallery owner, Tissot, called, he said. He remembered something, about a receipt. A receipt? Yes. He said that a few weeks ago, Claudine sold one of her private sketches, not through the gallery, just something she passed along to a man. She asked Tissot to write the receipt so it looked official. To whom? Lucas passed over a copy. One original sketch, 200 francs, paid in cash, for Monsieur C. Bernot. The handwriting was Tissot's, neat and angular. Bernot? Maigret repeated. Not in our files. I've started searching through utility accounts, school records, hotel ledgers. Maigret nodded. Try the electoral rolls. That name's too deliberate to be a coincidence. He looked again at the receipt. Claudine had trusted Tissot enough to use his gallery's header, but she had not wanted to name the man directly, not until he was already gone. She sold the sketch, Maigret murmured, but not for the money. Lucas looked up. She wanted him to know she was watching, Maigret continued, that she had drawn him. She gave him something, not to keep, but to unsettle. Silence passed between them. That evening, Maigret walked the Pont-des-Arts himself. The mist had cleared briefly and the lamps shone yellow through the wet air. Tourists were gone. Lovers had retreated indoors. The boards beneath his feet were slick, and the river below moved with a quiet heaviness. He leaned on the railing and looked toward the city. He tried to picture her, Claudine, walking this same bridge, maybe with her sketchpad under her arm, maybe with the wind pushing hair into her eyes. She had drawn rooftops, railings, window reflections, but no eyes. Perhaps the man had asked her too many questions. Perhaps he had studied her as one might study a composition, not for truth, but for what lay hidden in the brushstrokes. Maigret lit his pipe and stood for a long time. She hadn't been killed in anger, or in fear, but perhaps in panic. The panic that comes when someone sees themselves too clearly in the eyes of another. Behind him a voice spoke. "Inspector?" He turned. A young officer stood at the bridge's entrance, raincoat unbuttoned. "Message from the station." A name came up. Maigret walked with him slowly. Lucas was waiting back at the quay. He didn't sit. His hand rested on the sketchpad Claudine had left behind. "We found him," he said. Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Camille Bernot. Former lecturer in aesthetics, dismissed 2 years ago for inappropriate conduct toward students. Where is he now? He rents a flat above a printmaker's studio. Rue des Grands Augustins. Maigret nodded. No smile. No victory. Just the quiet certainty that something had moved. Tomorrow, he said. We go tomorrow. The mist was back by the time he returned home. Madame Maigret had left the radio playing softly in the kitchen. He poured a small glass of Calvados and sat by the window. Below, the street glistened. The bakery across the road had turned off its lights. But one figure remained, passing slowly beneath the yellow glow of the street lamp. A man in a brown overcoat. No umbrella, no urgency, just a presence. The following morning, the fog had returned, thicker than the day before. It rolled between buildings like a patient tide, softening edges and turning familiar streets into pale corridors of silence. Maigret arrived early at the Quai des Orfèvres, already dressed in his overcoat and gloves. He greeted Lucas with a brief nod and said only, "Let's go." They took no car. The address was not far. Rue des Grands Augustins lay tucked in a quiet bend between the river and the bustle of Saint-Michel. The buildings there were tall and narrow, their shutters closed even in mid-morning. Once a neighborhood of engravers and small publishers, it had become a quiet alcove of forgotten corners and fading paintwork. The printmaker's studio on the ground floor was dark. Through the window, Maigret could just make out the outline of a hand-operated press, still dusted with yesterday's filings. They stepped through the side gate into a courtyard of cracked flagstones, where a single flight of exterior stairs led up to a wooden door. Lucas knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. This time, a sound. Not footsteps. The scrape of a chair on wood, then silence again. Maigret waited. He had no intention of rushing. Instead, he took out his pipe and began to fill it carefully, tamping down the tobacco with a kind of quiet deliberation that said more than any uniform ever could. When he lit it, the flame danced briefly, then faded. The door opened. A man stood in the doorway, mid-40s, perhaps older, trim beard, thin features. A brown overcoat hung over a chair behind him. He was not dressed for guests. "Camille Bernot?" Maigret asked. The man nodded slowly. His eyes flicked to Lucas, then back. "We'd like a word," Maigret said. Bernot didn't answer, but he stepped back. The flat was spare, clean, no clutter, no decoration. A table with 2 chairs. A bookshelf, half full. A stovetop kettle sat unheated on the range. Maigret entered without removing his coat. He looked around once, then chose a chair and sat. "You know who I am?" he said calmly. Bernot gave the faintest of nods. "Then you'll know why we're here." Bernot sat opposite, crossing one leg over the other. He was composed, but not casual, like a man rehearsing stillness. "I suppose it's about the girl," he said. Maigret met his eyes. "Claudine Leguerne?" "Yes. You knew her?" Bernot hesitated. "We spoke, several times, at the gallery. She had an eye for detail." "Did you purchase a sketch from her?" "I did. Why?" Bernot leaned back slightly. "Because it captured something. A stillness I recognized. I thought it was honest." "Did you know she died?" "Yes, I read it in the paper. A short item. Young woman found in gallery, no foul play suspected." That was the phrasing, I think. Maigret studied him. There was no fear in Bernot's voice, only a kind of fatigued curiosity, as if waiting for the inevitable unfolding of an old conversation. "She mentioned you in her letters," Maigret said. She said you asked strange questions. Bernard's expression didn't change. Did she find them strange, or just unfamiliar? Maigret didn't answer. He took out the blue notebook and laid it on the table. She wrote things down, about what people hide, about the effect of rain. Bernard glanced at the notebook, but did not reach for it. She watched the world like an outsider. That's why I noticed her. Lucas remained standing by the door, arms crossed. He said nothing, but Maigret could feel his presence like a held breath. Did you follow her? Maigret asked. No. Did you visit her flat? No. Did you go to the gallery the night she died? A pause. Slight, but real. No, Bernard said. Where were you? Bernard looked out the window. The fog blurred the glass, turned the rooftops into smudged shapes. Here, he said, alone. I don't expect you to believe me. We don't deal in belief, Maigret replied. Just wait. Presence. What lingers? He leaned forward slightly. She drew you. Many times, not as a friend, as something unsettled, a presence in the room. Bernard lowered his gaze. His fingers twitched once on the edge of the table. She asked me once if people like being seen, he said. I told her. Not always. Sometimes being seen is unbearable. Is that how she made you feel? Bernard did not answer. Lucas stepped forward. We have a witness who remembers you. At the gallery, near closing. That proves nothing. No, Maigret said gently, but it adds to the weight. There was a silence then, long without movement. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to pause. Then Bernard stood. He didn't run, didn't raise his voice. He walked to a drawer, opened it, and retrieved a folded envelope. He placed it on the table. She gave this to me. Said I should open it if I ever felt afraid of what I was becoming. Maigret opened it slowly. Inside was a sketch. A simple image. A chair in a gallery. Empty. Light from an unseen window slanting across the floor. And in the bottom corner, the faint outline of a figure reflected in a glass frame. Not directly drawn, but implied. Watching! She saw me, Bernard said softly. In a way no one else had. Maigret asked nothing more. They left the flat quietly. Bernard did not resist. He came with them, his brown overcoat folded over one arm like a student heading to lecture. On the street, the fog clung to the stones. Back at the quay, Maigret sat in silence. The statement had been taken. There had been no confession, not in the legal sense. But Maigret knew the truth when it had no need of words. He poured himself a small glass of water. Across the desk lay the sketch, the empty chair, the reflection. She didn't accuse him, Lucas said quietly. She revealed him. Maigret nodded, and then he lit his pipe. Outside, the Pont-des-Arts waited, shrouded again, still. The day after Camille Bernard's quiet arrest, the weather broke. The fog lifted as if it had grown tired of hiding the city. In its place came a pale, indifferent sun that revealed the streets in their morning fatigue. Wet stones drying unevenly, gutters glinting with leftover mist, and chimneys coughing steam into the sky like sighs from sleepless rooms. Maigret sat alone in his office, the pipe resting cold on the blotter before him. The file on Claudine Legurn's death remained open, though most of the facts had now been gathered like tired leaves swept to the curb, and yet Maigret had not signed off. Not yet. Lucas knocked and entered quietly, holding 2 sheets of paper. Statements from Tissot and the concierge, he said. They both confirmed seeing Bernard in the gallery on several occasions, always near closing. No one else remembers him speaking, except Claudine. Maigret gestured for him to leave the papers on the desk. Anything from forensics? He asked. Nothing conclusive. No bruising, no toxins, just the faint traces of oil paint on her fingers and linseed near her collar. She painted that night. Lucas nodded. That's what they think. Right before she died. Maigret leaned back in his chair, fingers folded over his stomach. The window was open slightly, just enough to hear the distant roll of a delivery lorry on the quay below. The smell of river dampness mixed with the faint trace of tobacco that clung to everything in the office. She wasn't afraid of him, Maigret murmured. Lucas looked at him, puzzled. She wasn't frightened. Curious, maybe, but not afraid. That's what I keep coming back to. Lucas hesitated. Then, what happened? If he didn't force her, didn't threaten her? Maigret exhaled slowly. Sometimes a presence is enough. A weight. She saw something in him that disturbed her, but she didn't run. She tried to hold a mirror to it instead. The sketch, Maigret nodded, yes, but also the painting Tissot removed, the unfinished one, the figure in the chair, the blank face. She wasn't exposing him. She was showing him how she saw him. Lucas frowned. And that drove him to— We don't know, Maigret said gently. We may never. Perhaps she said something. Perhaps he looked at the painting and felt accused. But no violence. Maigret tapped the file lightly with his knuckle. No need for it. Not all deaths require force. Some happen in silence. She may have fainted. She may have stopped breathing out of grief, out of recognition. We call it natural causes, but we never call it what it truly is. Lucas said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. And him? Bernard? Maigret shook his head slowly. I think he thought she could see him, not just the parts he showed, but what lay beneath. And in her stillness, in her observation, he felt revealed. Lucas shifted. Do we charge him? Maigret looked out the window. The Pont-des-Arts was clearly visible now. No mist, no veil, just the bridge as it always was, carrying strangers across the river unaware of the stories it connected. We question him again, Maigret said, not to prove anything, just to see what he'll say when there's nothing left to conceal. Later that afternoon, Maigret returned to the gallery. Tissot had reopened, though only one or two curious visitors drifted inside. He looked thinner somehow, or perhaps just more aware of his surroundings. The bell above the door gave a brittle chime as Maigret entered. I didn't think you'd return, Tissot said from behind the small counter. I wanted to see the space again, Maigret replied. Without fog, without her. Tissot gave a quiet nod and stepped aside. The gallery was unchanged. The same quiet light, the same modest sketches and half-forgotten canvases. But to Maigret, it all felt different. Heavier, perhaps, as though the walls remembered what had passed within them. He walked to the back room again. The chair was there. So was the table, now covered in exhibition pamphlets and unused placards. But it was the air that spoke to him, a sense that something had once lingered, something now gone. Why didn't you tell me about the painting sooner? He asked, without turning. Tissot exhaled through his nose. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered to her. I know that now. Maigret turned. You removed it to protect her? Tissot's lips pressed together. I removed it because it disturbed me. I'd seen her work dozens of times, but that piece, it wasn't like the others. It felt too intimate. Not in subject, in gaze, like she had caught something she wasn't supposed to. Do you still have it? Yes. Keep it, Maigret said. She left it here for a reason, maybe not for you, maybe not even for him, but it belongs to this place. Tissot nodded slowly. On his way back to the office, Maigret stopped briefly along the river. He stood near a railing above the water, looking down into its slow grey churn. It reflected little in the afternoon light, just streaks of movement, half-glimpsed shapes. A man passed behind him, carrying a bouquet of irises in brown paper. A woman trailed after with a basket of bread. 2 students crossed the bridge, their voices low and laughing. The world carried on. And in that quiet persistence, Maigret found something resembling peace. Back at his desk, he closed the file on Claudine Leguerne. There would be no trial, no headlines, no justice in the courtroom sense, but the truth, or a version of it, had surfaced quietly, like the mist lifting. He lit his pipe and sat still. Outside, the Pont-des-Arts gleamed beneath a clearing sky. He watched it for a long time, until the light began to fade once more. That evening, after the reports were filed and the offices at the Quai des Orfèvres had emptied into the night, Maigret remained at his desk. The hum of the city was quieter now, subdued by a drizzle that had returned, as if the sky had thought better of its earlier clarity. He sat with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cup of coffee grown lukewarm beside him, and the sketch of the empty gallery chair lying flat in front of him, untouched. It had not been officially classified as a murder. The medical examiner had found no trauma, no marks of struggle. Claudine Leguerne had simply stopped. Her heart had failed, or her breath had. A peaceful death, as deaths go. Yet it was the kind that left behind more questions than comfort. Maigret didn't mind the gray zones. He knew the law worked in lines, but people did not. People lived in smudges, half-said things, forgotten glances. Claudine had died not from a blow or a fall, but from something that had weighed on her unseen. A gaze too long held, a silence too full, the unbearable nearness of being known too well by a stranger. Lucas tapped at the office door lightly. "She didn't leave a will," he said, "but her sister, Elise, has been informed. She's coming from Nancy tomorrow. Wants to see her things." Maigret nodded. "He knows the circumstances?" he asked. Lucas hesitated. "Only the basics. Found alone in the gallery. No signs of violence. The rest—" He let the sentence hang. "She'll want to ask why," Maigret said softly. Lucas didn't answer. He turned to go, then stopped. "Breno asked to speak with you again. Now? He said—" "It doesn't matter when. He just wants to talk. He's not asking for anything." Maigret considered. "Let him wait until morning. One more night in silence won't harm him." After Lucas left, Maigret finally stood and walked to the window. The mist hadn't thickened, but the rain painted the cobbles in watery reflections. The Pont-des-Arts was visible again, every lamp along it casting amber halos in the damp. It was late, and still he did not go home. Instead, he found himself walking slowly along the quay, coat collar up, pipe tucked into his pocket. The wind moved without urgency. The water smelled of iron and memory. He crossed the bridge alone, each wooden plank beneath him slick with rain. Midway across, he paused and turned toward the center of the river. There was no grand thought in his head, no conclusion to reach, only the image, again, of that chair. Claudine, sitting there, waiting, listening for something. Perhaps for nothing. She had been a girl without scandal, no enemies, no jealous lovers, only a quiet presence, a talent for observation, and a sketchbook full of rooms that no one else had noticed. And yet, she had drawn him. Not with anger or accusation, but with an eerie honesty. a mirror that no one had asked for. Maigret continued walking. The next morning arrived with a bruised sky and a smell of burned bread wafting from a bakery on the Rue Saint-Louis. Elise Le Guern stood in the lobby of the Quai des Orfèvres, looking smaller than her sister, rounder in the face, her coat too formal for the weather. She clutched her handbag tightly, like a nervous passenger boarding a train. Maigret met her at the steps. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said gently. "Thank you. It hasn't settled yet." Her voice was level, but her eyes were clouded. "She lived quietly," Maigret said, "kept to herself. But she was well regarded." Elise smiled faintly. "That sounds like her. Always too polite. She left sketches. Not many possessions. Some letters to you. She never sent them." "No." He offered to take her to the gallery if she wished. She hesitated, then nodded. At the Galerie André, the rain had paused. The windows were streaked, but light broke through in soft bands. Tissu had closed for the morning and waited inside, his hands folded, face unusually pale. He greeted Elise with the careful warmth of someone who had seen sorrow before and knew better than to offer solutions. Maigret stepped back as she walked slowly through the space. She paused near a canvas of rooftops, another of hands holding a teacup. She ran a finger along the edge of one frame. "She watched people without speaking to them," she said, "even as a child. She had notebooks full of café sketches, not the people, but the space between them." Maigret remained still. At the rear room she stopped. Her eyes found the chair. She didn't ask which one, she already knew. "Was it a heart attack?" she asked. "Yes," Maigret replied. "That's what the medical report says." "But not just that." "No," he said quietly. "Something else. Something we can't file away." She sat in the chair. It creaked slightly. "I remember this silence," she said. "From our old room. At night, when Claudine couldn't sleep. She'd sit like this for hours, waiting for something to make sense." Maigret watched her with a kind of reverence. The moment didn't need interruption. When she rose, she asked to see the painting. Tissot brought it out from the storeroom and leaned it against the wall. Elise stood before it, breathing shallowly. "She left his face blank," she said, "but not because she couldn't see it." Maigret met her eyes, "Because she didn't want us to." Later, back at the station, Maigret sat with Camille Bernot one last time. There were no forms on the desk, no tape recorder, just the sketch between them, the empty chair in the shaft of light, and the faint reflection of a man who might have been watching. Bernot looked older. His beard had not been shaved. His voice, when it came, was low. "I didn't touch her," he said. "You know that." Maigret didn't reply. "I thought she saw me, but not the surface. Something deeper. I thought that was intimacy." "And when it wasn't?" Maigret asked. "I didn't know what it was. There was no confession, only acknowledgement, a nod toward the truth, even if it could not be caged by evidence. When Maigret stood, Bernot did not ask where he would be taken. He simply looked down at the sketch once more. "She drew me as I am," he whispered. "And I couldn't bear it." Outside, the rain had begun again, and on the Pont-des-Arts the mist returned, soft as breath against glass. The rain softened as morning gave way to afternoon. It no longer fell exactly. It floated, like a fine gauze unraveling over the rooftops, blurring the edges of shutters and gutters, lending the city an air of reluctant stillness. From his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret watched the droplets bead along the window pane. His pipe had gone out twice. He made no move to relight it. The file on Claudine Le Guern remained on his desk. not closed, not entirely open. Its pages no longer rustled with urgency. They merely lay flat now, waiting, as if asking him whether there was more to be written, or if the silence that had enveloped her final moments should be left undisturbed. He rose, slowly, and walked to the window. The bridge, Pont-des-Arts, stretched across the Seine like a delicate thought suspended in motion. Pedestrians passed over it in twos and threes, their umbrellas nodding gently in rhythm with the weather. Maigret watched them without envy. It was the kind of day he found bearable, even comforting. Weather that made no demands. Lucas appeared at the door but did not enter. "The sisters left," he said. "Train back to Nancy this morning." Maigret nodded. "She take the sketches? All but one?" "Which one?" Lucas held it out. The small blue notebook. The one Claudine had filled with fragments and observations. No names, no stories, just lines like whispers collected from the walls of cafes and rain-slick sidewalks. "She said she didn't want to carry something unfinished." Maigret took it from him and turned a few pages. There were sketches of hands, stairs, doorways, but also lines of text written in her precise hand. "We carry mirrors inside us. Some we cover, some we forget. But sometimes someone holds one up, and we don't recognize the face." He closed the notebook gently. "Any news from the prosecutor?" he asked. "They'll review it, but the recommendation is psychological instability." "No formal charges." Maigret said nothing. He had known that would be the outcome. Camille Bernot had committed no legal crime, not in the strict sense. There had been no violence, no coercion, just presence, just being there. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes being seen too clearly by the wrong person was a kind of slow tragedy with no audience. After Lucas left, Maigret gathered his coat and hat. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The silence was enough. He walked slowly across the city, down narrow streets where the stones held the scent of coal smoke and bread. He passed closed shutters, puddles reflecting motionless chimney pots, the occasional sound of a dog barking behind a wrought-iron gate. The city was ordinary again, and somehow that made the whole thing feel heavier. He arrived at the Galerie André just after midday. Inside, André Tissot was speaking with a young couple, showing them a painting with measured enthusiasm. When he saw Maigret, he excused himself and walked over. He looked older than before, or perhaps more alert to what time could do. "She's gone?" he asked quietly. Maigret nodded. "I wanted to thank you," Tissot said. "For not... dramatizing it. It wasn't a story for drama." No, it wasn't. They stood in silence for a while. Then Maigret asked, "You said she painted differently near the end. Do you think she knew?" Tissot considered. "Not knew exactly, but I think she felt something closing in. A pressure, like the last days of summer. You sense a change before it comes." "Did you ever ask her?" "No," he said. She wouldn't have answered. Maigret wandered through the gallery. The walls were modest again, lined with small canvases that said little loudly. But he knew what had been here, what had been felt here. He paused before a new piece, one of Claudine's final sketches, framed now in pale wood. Not for sale, not titled. It showed a room, simple and unremarkable. A window opened toward the river. A figure stood beside it, facing away, only the back of the head visible, and just visible, in the corner, a second figure, seated, turned slightly, as if mid-conversation. The lines were faint, hesitant, as if the artist had not wanted to commit entirely. Maigret stared at it for some time. "She left it unsigned?" he asked. Tissot nodded. "I think she didn't want it to belong to anyone." Later that day, Maigret stopped by Claudine's building on Rue Jacob. The concierge greeted him with a knowing nod, as if grief passed through stairwells as naturally as winter air. "She kept to herself," the woman said again, her words like wallpaper repeating. Maigret climbed the stairs one final time. The door to her room was ajar. Inside, the room was nearly empty. The sister had packed the essentials. The wardrobe stood open. The table had been cleared. He stepped to the window. Rain had begun again, not a downpour, but a misting drizzle, soft as breath on glass. Below, a man pushed a cart of onions along the street, the wheels creaking faintly with each turn. Maigret lit his pipe. The smoke drifted lazily toward the open pane. He imagined her there, in that room. On the final evening, maybe she had sketched, maybe she had written a final line, or maybe she had done nothing at all. Maybe she had simply sat and felt the weight of a presence she didn't understand. Maybe that was all. He left the notebook on her desk, not out of sentiment, but because it didn't belong anywhere else. Back at home, Madame Maigret had prepared onion soup. The flat smelled of bay leaves and warmth. She greeted him with her usual glance, not worried, but watchful. "You didn't eat lunch," she said. "I wasn't hungry." She poured a glass of wine for him without asking, and sat at the table slicing bread slowly. "How did it end?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "She saw something in someone," he said, "and it was too much." Madame Maigret didn't answer, but she reached out and placed a hand gently over his. The evening passed quietly. The rain fell without sound against the windows, and somewhere across the city the Pont-des-Arts disappeared once more into mist. For several days Maigret did not revisit the case. Not out of neglect, but because there was no action left to take. The file sat in his drawer under a stack of more routine matters, a burglary in Montparnasse, a pensioner's complaint about forged documents, a waiter found unconscious behind a cinema in the 11th arrondissement. The city rolled on, shifting its quiet burdens like a creature shaking off sleep. And yet, Claudine Yearn stayed with him. She lingered not in the facts, but in the feeling. The stillness of the gallery room, the sketch with the half-drawn face, the rainlight catching on empty chairs. She had left no final gesture, no decisive clue to comfort the living, just fragments. Notebooks, a reflection in glass, a girl-shaped silence that seemed to follow Maigret now when he walked the quieter streets. One afternoon he found himself in the Luxembourg Gardens, seated beneath a chestnut tree that had begun to shed its leaves with the tired confidence of late autumn. He had no clear reason to be there. The office had grown noisy. Or perhaps he had simply needed space to sit without expectation. Children darted between benches. A woman fed crumbs to a line of birds. The fountain burbled behind him, indifferent as always. He thought of the first time he had seen Claudine's face, not in life, but in death. The tilt of her head, the way her arms rested, not in collapse, but in repose. It hadn't looked like surrender. It had looked like waiting. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Commissioner?" Maigret turned. A man stood nearby, hat in hand, thin, perhaps 50, with a book tucked under one arm. He did not smile. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the man said, "but I believe you've been speaking to people about Camille Bernot." Maigret studied him without replying. The man hesitated, then took a step closer. "I knew him. Once. A long time ago. We taught together at the École des Beaux-Arts too." Maigret gestured for him to sit. The man obliged, slowly, as if unsure whether he deserved the bench. "I'm not coming to defend him," he said. "We lost touch years ago. But I remember the way he was, interested in those who paid attention to him. Not admired him, exactly. Watched him. He used to say the world was only real when someone else was seeing it." Maigret drew on his pipe. "Did he speak of Claudine?" "No. But when I saw her name in the paper, I remembered something. Years ago, a student came to me. She said Bernot made her uncomfortable, not by touch, by interest. She felt, did it as a person, but as a subject. Did you report it?" The man looked down at his shoes. "I spoke to the director. Nothing came of it. Bernot was well regarded, brilliant, they said. It was easier to assume the girl misunderstood." Maigret nodded once. The story wasn't unfamiliar. "Do you think he killed her?" Maigret didn't answer at first. "I think he was part of what killed her," he said finally, "but so were others. The weight didn't come from one direction." The man stood again, his shoulders squared a little more firmly now. "Thank you for your time," he said. "I just thought you should know he wasn't always invisible." Maigret watched him go. That evening, back at the quay, he reopened the file. He found the original sketch. The chair in the gallery, the reflection in the glass. He stared at it for a long while. Then, almost without thinking, he took a pencil from his drawer and made a single mark, 2 dots, faint and almost invisible, where the eyes of the reflected figure might have been. It changed everything. The figure was no longer just watching. It was being seen. The next morning, Maigret returned to Rue Jacob. The room Claudine had rented was now empty. A new name had been written in chalk on the concierge's board downstairs. But Maigret climbed the stairs anyway. He stood in the corridor, not to investigate, but to remember. The silence felt different now, less tragic, more resolved. The kind of silence that follows the final note of a piano, when no one dares to move just yet. A letter had arrived for Claudine the day before. The concierge had found it that morning, and, unsure what to do, handed it to Maigret. It was from a bookshop on Rue d'Odéon. He walked there slowly down the narrow side streets, past cafes setting out chairs, the smell of steam rising from manhole covers. The bookshop was small and old, its front window filled with poetry and untranslated novels. The man behind the counter looked surprised when Maigret mentioned Claudine's name. "She used to come here often," he said. "Never bought much, but she read." "Did she speak of anyone?" "No, but she left something." He bent behind the counter and retrieved a slim folder. Cardboard, faded green. Inside were 3 pencil drawings, each of the same figure from different angles. In the final one, the face was almost complete, except the eyes. "She said she was working on a study," the bookseller said. A portrait of someone she didn't want to recognize. Maigret held the drawing gently. The lines were soft, uncertain, but the mouth was precise, firm, almost cruel. "She left no name?" "Only a note. Said if anyone asked for it, to let them see." Maigret read the note. "Sometimes we draw the ghosts before we understand they are haunting us." That evening, Maigret sat with Madame Maigret as she peeled potatoes in the kitchen. The radio played softly. A cat meowed in the courtyard below. He didn't mention the sketch. He didn't have to. "I've been thinking about that girl," she said suddenly. Maigret looked up. "She reminded me of someone I knew in school, quiet, observant. People thought she was shy, but she saw everything, even things she wasn't meant to." "Did something happen to her?" Madame Maigret nodded. Eventually, yes, but not quickly. It took years. People don't notice what they're doing sometimes. Or they do, and they hide it behind kindness. Maigret took her hand and squeezed it once, gently. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky remained heavy, but the air had changed, and somewhere near the Pont-des-Arts, the mist began to lift. The final days of October settled over Paris like a soft wool coat. Heavy, warm in places, but never quite comfortable. The rain came in brief murmurs, and the light broke through only at odd angles, casting long shadows even at midday. The city had begun its slow preparation for winter, and in the streets near the Seine, the sound of leaves scudding across the pavement was as common as the voice of a passing bus, or the clatter of heels on stone. Maigret woke early that Friday. He stood by the bedroom window with a cup of coffee cooling between his hands, watching the first signs of life emerge on the Rue des Récollets. The baker lifting his shutters, a girl hurrying with her scarf half-tied, and an old man dragging a cane through puddles not yet dried from the night's drizzle. He had nothing urgent on his desk that morning. A petty theft at a newspaper office. A dispute between neighbors over a shared clothesline. Nothing that would follow him home. And yet, as he dressed and gathered his coat, he took with him the slim folder containing Claudine Legern's final sketches. He arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres just after 8. Lucas had already made coffee, which steamed faintly on Maigret's desk. Outside the window, the Pont-des-Arts looked nearly translucent in the pale light, like something drawn in chalk. Maigret sat for a long time without moving, the sketches open before him. The 3 portraits. Always the same figure, not named, never finished, but by now he knew who it was, and more importantly, what it meant. Claudine hadn't drawn out of malice, nor had she drawn as a warning. She had drawn because it was her way of naming what could not be spoken. She had seen the contours of something in Camille Bernot, something that made her feel exposed, perhaps unsafe. And in sketching him, she had taken back some of the space he occupied. That space between observer and subject, between influence and intimidation. She had not meant to provoke. She had meant to understand, and when understanding failed, silence had taken its place. Maigret closed the folder. At 10 o'clock he received word from the prosecutor's office. Camille Bernot would not be charged. There was no legal basis for prosecution. He had not struck her, poisoned her, threatened her. No crime could be proven. Maigret had expected as much. He signed the necessary forms and returned the file to the cabinet. It slipped in without resistance, as if even the wood recognized its place. Just before lunch, Maigret returned to Rue Bonaparte. The Galerie André was open again, modest and unchanged. A new exhibition had been announced on the windows in faint blue script. Still lives and architectural sketches. Maigret stepped inside. Tissot greeted him with a polite nod. "I didn't think you'd come again. I'm not here to reopen anything," Maigret said, "only to return something." He handed the folder to Tissot, who took it without opening it. "She left those here in spirit, if not in fact," Maigret said. "They don't belong in a police drawer." Tissot looked at the folder for a moment, as if unsure whether it might burn his hands. "I'll keep them," he said finally. "Not for display, just to remember." They stood quietly near the rear room. The chair had been moved again. The light fell in a different place now. Stillness remained, but it was no longer the same. "She saw more than most," Tissot said softly. "Yes, but not enough to protect herself. That's the danger of perception, isn't it? You see things you'd rather not. Maigret didn't respond. He only nodded once and then left without another word. He walked slowly, his steps echoing faintly beneath the stone arches near the Seine. Paris had resumed its rhythm. A boy shouted for his mother near a tobacco shop. A woman argued over the price of chrysanthemums. Two workers in blue overalls joked in patois as they repaired a bent iron grate. And Maigret walked among them. Not detached, but not quite a part of it either. At the Pont-des-Arts, he paused. The bridge was nearly empty. A single painter, easel angled toward the river, dabbed at a canvas with long strokes. The clouds drifted in broken formations overhead. Maigret leaned against the railing. He looked down at the water. It flowed slow and grey, carrying leaves, paper scraps, the occasional bottle. Nothing dramatic. Just the residue of a city's life. He remembered what Claudine had written. Rain brings out what people keep hidden. But it wasn't only rain. It was also stillness. It was the pause between footsteps, the hush after someone leaves a room, the breath just before answering a question. That was where the truths lived. Not the loud ones, but the soft, enduring ones that refused to be buried. He took a final draw on his pipe, then tapped it out, gently on the heel of his shoe. Somewhere, a bell rang. Not a tolling of grief, just the marking of time. Maigret turned and walked back across the bridge, coat buttoned now against the wind. There would be other cases, new files, new lies, but this one would stay with him, not because of its darkness, but because of how quiet it had been. A girl with no enemies, a death with no violence, a mirror turned at just the wrong moment. And yet, for all its silence, it had said something. Something worth remembering,